If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Hello, my name is John Ledoux. I wanted to start off with this quote from El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, more commonly known as Malcolm X, because I think it illuminates the core of how the media can manipulate people to fit a predetermined narrative. We'll begin with a brief overview of how the media shapes the overall societal narrative and some of the techniques that are used. Then we're going to do a deeper dive into why this happens and who benefits. Framing a narrative. We, as people, use stories as a way to convey information, but we don't just dispassionately lay out a series of facts and figures, so how we tell those stories or narratives matter. How we frame events changes how people will perceive those stories. This is one of the most famous examples of how the same event can be framed in two different ways. This is from the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. You'll see the white people are finding food and the black person is looting a grocery store. These are all just pictures of people trying to survive a disaster, but one is framed as brave, the other as sinister. Here on the left, you can see a similar event. A black kid kicks a cop and gets called a thug. A white kid stabs a black kid to death and gets called a teen. And these are from the same issue of the same paper. On the top right is one of many examples of a police officer shooting someone and the media tripping over their words to not just say, cop shoots man, or police officer kills man, etc. They use passive phrases like, officer involved shooting. Okay, but how was the officer involved? Also on the right, we're looking at Angola, a massive prison in Louisiana. It might be the biggest in the country. If U.S. media talked about domestic issues the way they do things overseas, they would refer to our prisons as labor camps or possibly gulags. Outside of white supremacist Richard Spencer getting cold-cocked, the image on the right might be my favorite visual from Trump's 2017 inauguration. It shows masses of media members huddled around a burning garbage can, presumably trying to get a shot to show how chaotic and violent the protests were, as seen on the picture on the left. This falls into the if it bleeds, it leads category. Peaceful protests don't get nearly as much coverage as violent ones, even when the so-called violence is only against inanimate objects like garbage cans and windows. To better understand how framing a narrative can be effective, we also need to look at propaganda. I think we all have a certain idea in our head what is meant when we hear the term propaganda. We tend to think of dishonest or misleading information designed to elicit an emotional response, particularly fear and hatred, or further a political cause or viewpoint. And it is those things, sort of. Propaganda is a tool, and is generally used to elicit a response from the person viewing it or interacting with it, and it's all the more effective if the person doesn't recognize what is happening. But it's not necessarily bad or evil, it's just a tool, and tools can have both good and bad uses. A hammer can help build a home, it can also crack a skull. We're subject to propaganda all the time, often without realizing it. On the left, we're looking at a Soviet poster critiquing the violence that black people face in America, both from the police and the Klan. A depiction of the phrase, cops and Klan go hand in hand. On the right, we see anti-communist propaganda suggesting that communists are trying to take over the world. I think these are kind of typical of what we might think of when we think of propaganda. But what about what comes at us internally? For instance, any film or TV show that uses military equipment must get their script approved by the Department of Defense. Otherwise, they won't get the equipment. So, most TV and films depict the military in a positive light. Also, the huge number of shows that depict the police. In these shows, even the comedies, the police are shown to be the good guys, and they almost always get the bad guy. Rarely do you see corruption, police brutality, etc. And when we do, the police are still shown to be good overall. How does this align with the lived experience of many people in the US, especially black, brown, and poor people? These shows are often referred to as propaganda. For the CIA and military, how do these shows align with the experiences of people subjected to frequent bombings? Regardless of your opinion of the police and military, I think it's clear that their depictions in popular media do not tell the full picture, and we have to ask ourselves why. Who benefits from this? Because a lot of money goes into making these programs. If all or most of your experience with the police comes from what you watch on TV, why would you question the official police narrative? Why would they lie or mislead you? By having so many law enforcement officers come into your home every night through the TV, you may begin to feel like you know who the police are, how they operate, and how valuable they are. Even if none of these things hold up to the lived experiences of so many people, you may still begin to instinctively feel that anyone who crosses paths with them is in the wrong. Another common tactic is making events seem like they occur in a vacuum. Nothing before today has led up to today. Each thing stands completely on its own. This is obviously not how the world works, but it is how we're expected to consume the news. Despite a pledge to halt deportations for the first 100 days of their administration, Biden and Harris had already deported hundreds of people by February 1st. Further, they have bluntly told the people of Haiti and Guatemala to not come here. What nearly all articles written about this fail to include is any sort of history as to why these countries are in turmoil and why their people are fleeing. The US and US-based companies have a long and brutal history of interfering with countries in the Caribbean and Central and South America. In Guatemala, as early as 1954, the U.S. overthrew the democratically elected leader because they felt he was too soft on communism. Since that time, there have been targeted assassinations of union leaders, training of brutal security forces, massacres of indigenous people, and so on. Haiti is much the same. The U.S. backed the coup of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the country's first democratically elected president, and has interfered with elections ever since. Jovenel Moïse is currently still ruling even after his term ended, and he is backed by the U.S. U.S. interference in Haiti goes back at least until 1915, when it began an occupation of the island nation. So the answer to why people are trying to come to the U.S. for asylum is often because of U.S. policies in their home countries, but rarely will you see that part brought up in mainstream media outlets. Lastly, we'll look at another way that the media forms our perception of people and events. It's not just what they tell, but what they leave out, what they choose to cover, and what they don't. You may have seen the protests in Russia earlier this year. They garnered a lot of media attention. They focused primarily on Alexei Navalny, who is portrayed as a critic of Putin and an anti-corruption crusader. And why not draw attention to him in these protests? As you can see from a write-up in The Nation, finally, a Russian liberal preaching shareholder capitalism and free expression. What's not to like? Well, what is being left out is Navalny's longtime anti-immigrant stance and his coziness with the Russian far right, including literal neo-Nazis. The question we have to ask ourselves is, why focus on him and these protests? Do the major U.S. outlets simply cover all large protests throughout the world? The answer to that is no. You may not have heard of the protests in India, even though at 250 million protesters, it was the largest in world history and continues to this day. So we have to ask ourselves, why does the media focus on thousands protesting in Russia, but largely ignore 250 million people protesting in India? One answer could be that the changes they are protesting are supported by Western corporations like Monsanto Bayer, PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, Tyson, and Cargill. Another may be that the Indian protests have been organized primarily by farmers' unions and communists. Thinking back to the Malcolm X quote, and the title of this presentation, along with the Indian farmers and workers movement, I'm reminded of Eugene Debs in his famous anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, the one he was jailed for. In it, he described newspapers twisting his words and drastically misconstruing his writings in their coverage. His claim is that the papers wanted to cause dissension within the movement. While not an exhaustive list of media techniques to reinforce the hegemony, you can get a general picture of how this is done. The larger question, and the one we'll spend more time on, is why? Why does the media operate this way? Who benefits? Debs gave his answer, but let's take a closer look. In order to see who benefits from the way the media operates, it is important to understand the larger context. Here, we're talking about the superstructure, all of the pieces of a society. What Marx is essentially saying is when a class becomes a ruling class, they begin to create and distribute the ideas that justify their rule, the new order of things. It is important that this order seem not only rational, but inevitable and unchangeable. In modern context, the thinkers of the ruling class are the media, and it is therefore their job to not only justify the status quo, but uphold it as the ideal. For example, plenty of digital ink has been spilled lately discussing a so-called labor shortage. Pushed by the Chamber of Commerce, there is a lot of talk of labor shortages and how unemployment benefits must be cut to push people back to work. The other side, within the acceptable parameters of debate, is that labor is supply and demand. If there is a demand for labor, then the cost should naturally go up. If you want people to sell their labor for wages, you provide higher wages. What is never discussed is why we have unemployment at all. We have crumbling infrastructure. 1/3 of our daycares have closed since the pandemic began. Many parts of rural America still don't have high-speed internet. Flint and many other towns and cities don't have safe drinking water, etc. If, after all of that is taken care of, we still have unemployment, wouldn't people with multiple jobs like to have just one? Wouldn't workers prefer shorter or fewer days, or both? None of these ideas make it into the mainstream press because they call into question the status quo. These questions are simply not allowed to enter the national dialogue because the media acts as gatekeeper of ideas and determines which will see the light of day. We have plenty of work to be done and plenty of people looking for work, and yet the problems persist. To quote the late Archbishop Helder Camara, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." In terms of media, it would seem we have an abundance of choices. If that's so, why do they all seem to report the same things in the same ways, or at least within a certain limited range of disagreement? That's because they're basically all owned by the same people. And it's not just the media. These same financial firms are some of the largest stakeholders of defense contractors like Honeywell, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. You'll also find them near the top of energy companies like ExxonMobil, BP, and Halliburton. These three companies are far from the only ones involved in this. You can add Goldman Sachs, Capital Research and Management, and so on. But they do represent some of the largest funds. So how does this work? As finance capital began to be concentrated into fewer and fewer banks or financial institutions, the remaining banks began to grow in power until they reached a monopoly, or at least an oligopoly. While we see overlapping investors and board members play out today, it's important to understand that this is not a new development. The German economist Zeitels did a study and found that 6 of the largest banks in Germany were represented in 344 industrial companies and by their board members in 407 others. Likewise, many of the biggest industrialists were on the boards of these same banks. We also find many board seats are filled by former civil servants and those connected to the government. This study was conducted in 1905. Now, for some of you, this meme may have popped into your head, and I don't blame you. But hear me out. Today, Disney's board of directors has a former U.S. trade representative, a former Goldman Sachs employee, and the CEO of Oracle. News Corp's board has a former state senator, the CEO of Naya Capital Management, and a former president of Spain. Comcast CEO was on Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, and the board has the CEO of DuPont and the former CEO of Bank of New York Mellon. To help understand this, let's take a look at a visualization done a couple of years ago by the team at Data Interview Questions. What we're looking at is the connections between the board members of the 50 largest public companies. You can see how Disney shares board members with Visa, Coca-Cola, Wells Fargo, Apple, and Facebook. The question we have to ask is, did the Disney connection to Coke influence ABC News coverage, or lack thereof, of the union leader assassinations in Guatemala? Disney is just an example, but they are far from unique. Data analyst Eric Rude, who put this visualization together, told Fast Company the number of connections gets much larger when you expand the scope beyond 50 companies or expand to second and third degree connections. But it becomes pretty difficult to fit into any sort of visualization. While many companies are publicly owned, the percentage of that ownership is concentrated into just a few hands. The top 10% own 70% of the value of all stocks, whereas the bottom 60% only own 7%. What this means in terms of actions is that the large ownership stakes have the ability to make the decisions. An example of how this plays out is, just last month, independent shareholders of Thomson Reuters voted to review the company's contracts with ICE over human rights concerns. However, the devil is in the details. The Woodbridge Company, the private holding company of the Thompson family, controls about 68% of the shares and voted against it, meaning it's going nowhere. So while stocks may be public, control is still pretty private. Does media ownership dictate the news? Well, by the 1920s, William Randolph Hearst had 28 newspapers across the country. He specialized in yellow journalism with a focus on sensationalism at the expense of ethics and professionalism. By the 1930s, his papers were running columns by Goebbels and Hitler, who he admired for his nationalism and anti-communist stance. I think it's safe to say in this case, ownership clearly dictated the news. Decades later, Australian media mogul Rupert Murdoch would use his media outlets in the US and around the world to promote right-wing ideologies and politicians. Ronald Reagan credited his New York Post for helping him win the 1980 presidential election. In recent years, Sinclair Broadcasting has sent out specific scripts for their local news anchors to read. A video by Deadspin combining these went viral in 2018.
Hi, I'm Fox San Antonio's Jessica Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about troubling and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 So yes, media ownership can definitely dictate the news. Coming back to the methods used to shape their narrative, let's look again with this new frame in mind. What is violence? Inevitably, when a window is broken during a protest, the media will describe the protest as turning violent. But how is violence defined? Who defines it? In this case, during a protest against police terror, there were no injuries to any persons, yet it was still deemed violent. This winter, when the Texas power grid failed, people died. Estimates range from as low as 151 and as high as 700. Officials knew this could happen and actively chose not to do anything about it because it would have cost money. This choice led to the death of a lot of people and the suffering of even more. However, this is viewed as a failure, a catastrophe, a tragedy, etc. But no mainstream media outlets dared to call it violence. It's quiet violence, but violence nonetheless. The same can be said for homelessness. There are far more empty houses than there are unhoused people, but there is a choice not to put these people in those houses. That choice is an act of violence. Food waste is a serious issue in the U.S., yet 1 in every 7 children worry about their next meal. The choice not to distribute the abundance of food in this country so that no one goes hungry is a choice. That choice is an act of violence. This type of violence has a name: social murder. Frederick Engels defined social murder over 150 years ago. Paraphrasing Engels, when a society deprives people of the necessities of life, puts them under conditions in which they cannot live, and knows that it will lead to their suffering and demise, yet does nothing, that is social murder. The murderer is unseen, and the death may appear natural since the offense is more omission than commission. But murder it remains. How violence is defined plays a pivotal role in who we see as good and bad, and the media are the primary arbiters. Window breakers are bad? Better send in the riot police. People going hungry? Thoughts and prayers. Returning now to propaganda. These are some of the movies I grew up with as a kid. In all of these, even Stripes, the Soviet Union is the enemy. Red Dawn manages to also include Cuba and Nicaragua. These movies were not cheap to make. In fact, Rambo 3 was the most expensive film ever made at the time. There was obviously a lot of capital that went into creating, promoting, and distributing these films. Looking at today, we can find more examples. In 2005, 5 Venezuelan student leaders went to Serbia to train at the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, aka CANVAS. CANVAS receives most of its funding from the CIA front group, the National Endowment for Democracy. After returning to Venezuela, Juan Guaido, one of those students, led a number of anti-government rallies. Fast forward a decade, and Guaido is positioned to make a coup attempt from within the National Assembly. The U.S. government and U.S. media were quick to side with Guaido, claiming he was the rightful president. This is 2018. Also in 2018, Amazon announced Season 2 of its Jack Ryan series. This season would feature Venezuela as the opposition. The series was being filmed at basically the same time as the coup attempt. This could of course be a coincidence, although there have never been rumors of a nuclear-armed Venezuela, as we have seen in the show. It should be noted that Amazon is a major supplier of the Defense Department, that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and that 2 of the biggest institutional investors in Amazon are, again, Vanguard and BlackRock. As a side note, U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have decimated their economy. Just in 2017 and 18, it's estimated that sanctions led to over 40,000 deaths. The need for medical supplies during a pandemic has likely made the life of everyday Venezuelans that much worse. Returning again to how events are interconnected. As Father's Day was just a few weeks ago, there were likely another spate of opinion pieces published about fatherless homes being a crisis, especially for black families. These articles will talk about the link between single-parent households and crime and poverty. But these analyses, in addition to being racially insensitive in the best of cases, are shallow and incomplete. So how did we get here? We could go back as far as 1619 and talk about enslaved African families being split up. But let's fast forward to the 1970s. In the 70s, Nixon started the so-called war on drugs. But this war was really about stopping the rising tide of radicalism. Nixon sought to use his drug war to stop the Black Power and anti-war movements. Building on this drug war, the Reagan and Bush administrations upped the ante by using the CIA to smuggle crack cocaine into inner cities, knowing it would decimate the predominantly black communities there. Also, they could fund anti-communist death squads in Central America. From there, the Clinton administration enacted the 1994 crime bill, written primarily by the current president. The culmination of all these policies led to mass incarceration, where millions of people, disproportionately black, brown, and native, have had their freedom taken away so they can work in the last place where slavery is legal in the U.S. Between cheap labor and charging the incarcerated exorbitant fees for things as simple as phone calls, there is a lot of money to be made in prisons, even the ones that aren't private. A 2020 report showed around 4,100 corporations who profit from the prison industry. Talking about symptoms without talking about root causes is one of the ways the media shifts the blame to victims instead of the real villains. Now finally, we're back to omission. You may not have heard, but last month a group of activists held a picket line at the port of Oakland to block an Israeli shipping company, Zim, from unloading its cargo. The Longshore Workers Union refused to cross the picket line, and the ship eventually left after losing millions of dollars while waiting. This was done in a response to a call for solidarity from the Palestine General Federation of Trade Unions after the bombing of Gaza and the continuing apartheid. While covered in the local press, this story never made national news. While sympathetic coverage of the Palestinians' plight has slowly been growing, there is never any discussion of ending the occupation and colonization, and little mention of solidarity in the U.S. Why is that?
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Israel is too important to U.S. foreign policy to allow discussions to go that far. While Human Rights Watch declared Israel an apartheid state, the acceptable options to discuss are a one-state solution with Israel as the one state, or a two-state solution. Never is there talk of a one-state solution that is a unified Palestine where all can live freely in a secular, democratic society. Imagine if South Africa's apartheid ended by splitting the country into two, one for the colonizers and one for the colonized. South Africa still has a lot of issues remaining from its apartheid, but a two-state solution is not one of them. Again, it is the media which controls the dialogue and determine which ideas are acceptable. The banks and other corporations that benefit from the status quo are also the owners of the media, which say this is the rightful and logical order of the world. Knowing the techniques used by the media is an important step in critical media literacy, but we need to move beyond that. We need to look at who owns and controls the media, what the media's purpose really is, and how they shape the views of millions of Americans. Only after we fully understand the problem can we begin to solve it. Thank you for watching, and all references are available upon request.